When a crime occurs, the police usually act swiftly. Some cases are solved within days, others may take years. And then there are those that remain frozen in time, unanswered for decades. Yet sometimes, with a bit of luck and unwavering persistence, the truth finally comes to light. Welcome to Despacho del Crimen. Today we'll explore 5 cases that were solved many years after they began. Don't forget to leave a like. Tell us the time and place you're tuning in from. We love hearing from you. Let's begin. The case of Tracy Gilpin. On an October night in 1986, 15-year-old Tracy Gilpin left a neighborhood party in Rocky Nook, Kingston, Massachusetts. She was walking alone along the road toward a nearby convenience store when she vanished without a trace. 21 days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area, her skull brutally shattered. What began as an ordinary evening turned into a nightmare that would haunt her family for over 3 decades. And it was, in fact, one of her sisters who years later became the state's chief of police, who would play a pivotal role in the fight to uncover the truth. Tracy L. Gilpin was born on November 3, 1968. The youngest of 3 sisters, she lived with her family in the quiet coastal town of Kingston, Massachusetts. Those who knew her remember a shy, kind-hearted girl with a close-knit group of friends and a typical high school life. She was a sophomore at Silver Lake Regional High School. That night, October 1, 1986, she had decided to attend a party with friends, unaware it would be the last time she would ever see her family. The gathering went on without incident. Around 10:30 p.m., Tracy called her sister Melissa, asking to be picked up. While waiting, she decided to walk alone to a nearby convenience store, Cumberland Farms, to buy a pack of cigarettes. That short walk would mark the turning point in her story. Tracy was last seen in the store's parking lot where she used the public payphone. A store employee reported that she turned down a ride offered by someone and simply walked away. Shortly after, another witness claimed to have heard a scream and the sound of a car speeding away, but at the time no one paid it much attention. When Melissa arrived, Tracy was gone. Assuming she had left with someone else, the family didn't immediately suspect anything was wrong. But by the next morning, when Tracy hadn't returned home and no one had heard from her, they contacted the police. From that moment, the case shifted from a possible misunderstanding to a desperate search. Authorities launched an intensive manhunt around the neighborhood using helicopters, search dogs, and dozens of volunteers. Posters with Tracy's face were distributed across shops, schools, and gas stations. But there were no clues, no purse, no shoes, no signs of a struggle. She had vanished completely. Police questioned partygoers, store employees, neighbors, and drivers. They mapped out all possible routes and issued interstate alerts. Despite the effort, no concrete lead emerged. It wasn't until October 22, 21 days later, that a woman walking through the Miles Standish State Forest about 20 kilometers from Kingston noticed something unusual among the fallen leaves. What first looked like discarded debris was, in fact, the partially buried body of a teenage girl. She lay face down, covered by branches and soil, showing no signs of being moved post-mortem. It was Tracy. She had been struck in the head with a blunt object, so violently that her skull was fractured in multiple places. It was a direct, deliberate, and savage attack. The discovery shook the community. The forest where her body was found was a public space frequented by families, hikers, and cyclists. The crime scene was cordoned off, and forensic teams collected every possible trace of evidence. At the time, DNA analysis was still in its infancy, so the samples gathered were preserved in hopes that future technology would bring answers. The autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was massive cranial trauma. There was no conclusive evidence of sexual assault, but the condition and location of the body made it abundantly clear. This was no accident. Someone had murdered her. He had taken her there after killing her. With Tracy's body now in the hands of the authorities, the investigation turned to reconstructing her final hours. All calls made from the store's public payphone that night were reviewed. Witnesses reported seeing a Jeep or a dark-colored vehicle in the area. Acquaintances of the victim were interviewed, and investigators cross-referenced her case with other unsolved crimes. Yet every lead led to the same place, nowhere. For years, the case remained open but stagnant. The biological evidence was preserved in police custody, while the Gilpin family never gave up hope, especially Tracy's eldest sister, Carrie. As she grew older, Carrie decided to join law enforcement, eventually rising to become the superintendent of the Massachusetts State Police. Her motivation was never in question. She wanted justice for her sister. For decades, she kept the case alive from within the system, never violating protocol, but ensuring that Tracy's name was not forgotten. In 2016, with the advent of forensic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis, the case was reactivated. The original crime scene samples were retested and cross-referenced with national DNA databases. Then a breakthrough, a genetic match. The match led investigators to a man named Michael Hand, 61 years old, living in Troutman, North Carolina, in 1986. When Tracy disappeared, Hand had been living in Massachusetts, not far from where she was last seen. He was not a known criminal, nor someone with a visible history of violence. A former military man, he worked in private security and later relocated to the South, leading what appeared to be a normal, quiet life. But DNA doesn't lie. The evidence recovered from Trace's body conclusively matched Hand's genetic profile, making him the prime suspect. The investigators didn't rush. They quietly built their case. They confirmed that in 1986, Hand had a geographic link to the Cumberland Farms store and had been in the Plymouth area during the critical days. They sought witnesses who may have seen him interacting with teenagers and combed through old vehicle records. Though the case now centered on forensic evidence, the pieces surrounding Michael Hand's life were beginning to fall into place. On March 10, 2018, more than 31 years after the murder, Michael Hand was arrested at his home in North Carolina. The warrant had been issued by Massachusetts authorities, and local police assisted in the arrest. My Hand did not resist. The following day, he was extradited to Massachusetts, where the murder had taken place. News of the arrest spread quickly across both local and national media. This wasn't just another cold case. It was the long unsolved murder of a teenage girl whose sister had become one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the state. Carrie Gilpin, then superintendent of the Massachusetts State Police, released a public statement thanking investigators and the community for their unwavering support. While she made no direct reference to her sister Tracy, out of respect for the legal process, her words carried the weight of personal history. She acknowledged that while the arrest could never erase the pain, it represented a monumental step toward the justice her family had waited for over 3 decades. The arrest of Michael Hand prompted a range of reactions. For some, it brought long-awaited closure. For others, it raised unsettling questions. How had he escaped suspicion for so long? Why had no one connected him to the crime earlier? Had he harmed others? Police reviewed additional cold case files to determine whether Hand might have been involved in other unsolved crimes. However, to date, no formal links have been established between him and any other murders. During the preliminary hearings, Hand pleaded not guilty. His attorneys attempted to challenge the integrity of the DNA samples collected in 1986, citing potential contamination or breaches in the chain of custody. Yet the modern analyses were both clear and reproducible. The prosecution's case, at least from a forensic standpoint, was solid. It also came to light that several individuals had recalled seeing someone resembling Hand in the area that night. Though their statements were vague, blurred by the passage of time, they added circumstantial weight to the prosecution's argument. The trial was expected to begin in 2022. Prosecutors were building a case grounded in genetic evidence, inconsistencies in Hand's past statements, and his geographic proximity to the crime scene on the critical dates. Still, it would not be an easy trial. The defense would leverage the decades that had passed, the absence of direct witnesses and the inevitable gaps in collective memory. But just as the case appeared to be heading toward resolution, the unexpected occurred. In 2022, before the trial could officially begin, Michael Hand died at the age of 65. The cause of death was not publicly disclosed. His passing brought the legal proceedings to a close before a verdict could be reached. For Trace's family, it was a moment of mixed emotions, both relief and deep frustration. On one hand, forensic science had finally identified the man responsible. On the other hand, there would be no confession, no formal conviction, no opportunity to hear his explanation or see him answer for what he had done. No day in court, no justice served through the judicial process. And so the story of Tracy Gilpin came to its close, with a name, an arrest, and a death that came too soon. Her case was not simply another entry on the long list of unsolved crimes. It became a testament to the power of perseverance, to how science can shatter decades of silence, and to how personal commitment can transform grief into purposeful action. In the aftermath of Hand's death, Carrie Gilpin once again addressed the public. She reiterated what she had always said, that her career in law enforcement had been fueled by love for her sister. Every step she took as an officer had its roots in that October night when Tracy never came home. Today, Tracy Gilpin's memory lives on, In her family, her community, and in the evolving narrative of American criminal justice, her case helped rekindle interest in forensic technologies applied to cold cases. It inspired renewed investigations and brought attention to the long-lasting scars of violent loss. She was more than a victim. She was a sister, a daughter, a friend, and someone who deserved to be remembered not only for how she died, but for how her memory kept pushing the truth forward, year after year, until it was finally revealed. The case of Milton Curtis and Richard Phillips. A teenage couple was ambushed in an open field on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Just hours later, 2 police officers were executed at point-blank range in broad daylight. There were no cameras, no suspects, and it would be 45 years before anyone answered for those crimes. This is the story behind the murders of officers Richard Phillips and Milton Curtis in the early hours of July 22, 1957. A night like so many others began in the town of El Segundo, California. Just after 1:30 a.m., officers Richard Allen Phillips and Milton Curtis were patrolling a quiet stretch in South Los Angeles when they noticed a vehicle run a red light. It was an older model dark-colored Ford with a lone male driver. Seeing nothing immediately suspicious, they pulled the car over. Both officers were young. Curtis was only 25, with just 2 months on the force. Phillips, 28, had served as a Marine in Korea and had a few more years of experience. They were known as diligent, respectful, and deeply committed to their work. That night, they went out on patrol with no warning of what was about to unfold. The driver of the vehicle was Gerald Mason, a 23-year-old man originally from South Carolina. He was passing through California, but not for tourism or business. Earlier that very night, Mason had committed a brutal assault. He had stalked 2 teenage couples in a secluded area known as Lover's Lane in the city of Hawthorne. Armed with a gun, he robbed them, forced them to strip, and then raped one of the young women. He fled the scene in one of the victims' cars. While speeding away through the mostly empty streets, he ran a red light, and that's when officers Phillips and Curtis pulled him over. The exact sequence of events in the minutes that followed has been reconstructed through forensic evidence and later findings. Initially, Mason appeared cooperative. He remained seated as one officer approached the driver's side and the other inspected the vehicle. Then, without warning, Mason drew a .22 caliber revolver and fired. Curtis was shot first and fell critically wounded. Mason then stepped out of the car and shot Phillips in the back as he began writing the traffic citation. Despite his injuries, Phillips managed to return fire with his service weapon, wounding Mason before he fled. Before losing consciousness, Phillips managed to radio for help. His final words were barely audible: "Send ambulance." When backup arrived, both officers were lying on the pavement. Curtis had died instantly. Phillips was still alive but died shortly after being transported to the hospital. The El Segundo Police Department was devastated. It was the first time 2 of its officers had been murdered in such a senseless, brutal manner. There was no clear motive, no suspect, and worst of all, not a single solid lead. Police launched a sweeping manhunt. Homes and garages were searched. Hospitals were monitored for patients with gunshot wounds, but Mason had vanished. The belongings stolen from the teen victims earlier that night were found in an abandoned car. Investigators also recovered fingerprints, but in that era, national fingerprint databases were rudimentary. No matches, and no one named Gerald Mason appeared in any criminal records. Days turned into months. In 1960, 3 years after the double homicide, a revolver was found in the backyard of a home in Manhattan Beach. It was a .22 caliber weapon, and crucially, its serial number was still legible. Tracing the number led investigators to a Sears store in Shreveport, Louisiana, where it had been purchased in June 1957, less than a month before the murders. The buyer used a false name, George D. Wilson. The link was obvious, but authorities still lacked a real identity behind the alias. They believed they were close. Then the trail went cold once again. For decades, the names Richard Phillips and Milton Curtis were remembered annually by fellow officers, but the case remained unsolved. Meanwhile, the man responsible lived a free and seemingly ordinary life. Gerald Mason returned to the East Coast. He married, had children, and opened a series of gas stations. He was never arrested again. He lived quietly, undetected by law enforcement. And for more than 40 years, no one knew what he had done. Over 4 decades passed without progress. The case files, stored with other cold cases in a homicide unit archive, sat untouched for years. But forensic technology continued to advance. In the early 2000s, the FBI and other state agencies began digitizing old fingerprint databases, something that hadn't been possible in earlier decades. What once took weeks of manual comparison could now be cross-checked in seconds against millions of criminal records. In 2002, one of those matches changed everything. A fingerprint lifted from the stolen vehicle, used in 1957, was reprocessed through the newly automated national system. This time, it returned a hit, not from a known offender or a repeat suspect, but from an old record of a minor theft committed in 1956 in South Carolina. The name Gerald Phaeton Mason. Detectives from Los Angeles County were stunned. They pulled the file and confirmed that Mason had indeed lived in California during the summer of 1957. His physical description matched the composite sketches remembered by neighbors at the time. Then they uncovered more. In 1967, Mason had used the alias George D. Wilson to register at a hotel in Southern California. The same false name used to purchase the .22 caliber revolver connected to the murders. He also bore an old scar on his hip, precisely where Officer Phillips had fired at him. The wound's location matched the trajectory of the bullet described in the 1957 reports. There was no longer any doubt. After 45 years, the man responsible for the murders of Richard Phillips and Milton Curtis had a name, an address, and a face. On January 29, 2003, a team of FBI agents and homicide detectives traveled to Columbia, South Carolina. There, in a modest home, they found Mason living quietly with his wife. He was 68 years old. He offered no resistance. He was handcuffed in silence and taken into custody. In his initial statement, Mason did not deny the charges. He said little, only asking if he should get a lawyer. News of the arrest spread quickly across the country. For the city of El Segundo, it was like reopening a wound that had never truly healed. For the families of the fallen officers, it was a moment almost beyond words. Many of the relatives were no longer alive, but the children of both officers were. And after a lifetime of growing up in the shadow of loss, they finally knew the name of the man responsible. In March 2003, Mason appeared before a judge in California. He accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. In return, the charges related to the rape and robbery were dropped. The prosecutor made clear this was not about leniency, it was about sparing surviving victims the trauma of a lengthy trial. In court, Mason apologized. He claimed not to understand why he had done what he did, and said he had lived with the guilt for decades. He cried, but his tears moved no one. The daughter of Officer Phillips told him they weren't there to forgive, because forgiveness could not restore what he had taken. The son of Officer Curtis said that while Mason had lived a free life, their families had been forever marked. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to a state prison in California, though later, due to declining health, he was moved to a facility in South Carolina, closer to his remaining family. Gerald Mason died in prison on January 22, 2017, at the age of 82. For 45 years, Mason had lived without ever being held accountable. He married, raised children, attended school events, and was active in his community. No one, not his wife, not his children, not his neighbors, ever suspected that on one night in July 1957, he had murdered 2 police officers simply out of fear they might uncover a previous crime. The killings of officers Richard Phillips and Milton Curtis became one of the oldest unsolved police homicides in California to be resolved. It also served as one of the clearest reminders that even when justice seems forgotten, a single fingerprint can reopen the path to truth. Today in El Segundo, their names are etched into the fallen officers' memorial. They are remembered not only for how they died, but for the promise their deaths left behind. No matter how much time passes, someone will keep searching until the truth is found. The case of Maria Ridulph. It was a frigid afternoon in December 1957 when Maria Ridulph, a 7-year-old girl, vanished from a snow-covered street in her quiet hometown. Days later, her remains were discovered in a wooded area nearly 90 miles away. No one could explain who had taken her, why, or how. 50 years later, someone was arrested and then released. This is the full story of Maria Ridulph. It was Tuesday, December 3, 1957, in Sycamore, Illinois, a small town of just over 7,000 residents. Snow had blanketed the sidewalks and rooftops for days. Temperatures had fallen well below freezing, but that wasn't enough to keep children from playing outside. Sycamore was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Kids walked to school alone, played freely in the streets, and stayed out until porch lights flickered on. Maria Elizabeth Ridulph was 7 years old. At just 7 years old, Maria Ridulph was a slender girl with dark brown hair, bright brown eyes, and boundless energy. She was the youngest of 4 children in the home of Michael and Frances Ridulph. The family lived on the corner of Center Cross Street and Archie Place, a peaceful residential neighborhood lined with front lawns and homes without fences. Maria's best friend was Kathy Sigmund, an 8-year-old girl who lived directly across the street. That day after school, the 2 girls spent part of the afternoon cutting out paper dolls together. Restless and eager to play outside, they finally asked for permission to go out around 6:00 p.m. Though the sky was already darkening, it wasn't yet completely nightfall. Both wore winter clothing, boots, hats, and gloves. Maria's mittens had gotten wet, so Kathy lent her a dry pair. Around 6:45 p.m., as they played a favorite game they called Dodge the Cars, which involved jumping onto the sidewalk just before a car passed, a young man approached them. He wasn't running, he didn't seem disheveled. He was slim, clean-cut, and had either light brown or dark blonde hair. It was neatly combed and he wore a dark jacket. He smiled, introduced himself as Johnny, and started chatting with the girls. He asked if they liked dolls, then oddly asked if they liked pigs. The conversation was strange, but his tone was friendly. Maria replied that she did. Then Johnny crouched down and offered her a piggyback ride, what they called a chapuzzin. Maria laughed and accepted. She climbed onto his back while Kathy looked on. At that moment, Kathy remembered she had left her own mittens at home. She ran back to the house to retrieve them, a trip that took no more than 2 minutes. But when she returned to the street, Maria and Johnny were gone. There was no one in sight, no voices, no movement, no trace. Frozen in place, Kathy scanned the street and called out to her friend. No reply. In a panic, she ran to the Ridulph house to alert Maria's family. Michael Ridulph rushed outside, scouring the neighborhood. Soon, neighbors joined in. Then the local police. By 8:00 p.m., a formal search was underway. By 10:00 p.m., the state police and county authorities had been notified. The FBI was contacted the next morning. Over the next 24 hours, more than 100 people participated in the search. They combed through ditches, abandoned houses, cellars, and even the Kishwaukee River. But there was nothing. Kathy, though traumatized, gave the most detailed description she could. She said the man appeared to be between 20 and 25 years old, with short hair, wearing a coat, and speaking without an accent. She recalled that he seemed like a nice person, not someone who made her feel afraid. That description launched a massive wave of door-to-door inquiries. Police officers and FBI agents questioned every young man in the area known to have recent contact with children. One of those names was John Tessier, an 18-year-old who lived just 2 blocks away. His name appeared on the initial list of persons of interest. However, his mother told investigators that on the day of Maria's disappearance, John had taken a train to Chicago for a military enlistment medical exam with the Air Force. He had a train ticket as proof. Tessier was interviewed by the FBI, passed a polygraph, and was removed from the suspect list. Days passed, leads dried up, the case stalled, no one had seen anything. There were no witnesses, no footprints, no screams. The snow had covered and erased everything. It was unclear whether Maria had been taken far away or was still somewhere nearby. Then on April 26, 1958, almost 5 months after her disappearance, 2 men stumbled upon a body. They were foraging for wild mushrooms in a remote wooded area near Galena in Joe Daviess County, Illinois, some 160 kilometers from Sycamore. In the brush, they noticed something unusual. It was human remains, partially covered by leaves and branches. As they approached, they saw it was the body of a young girl. The remains were severely decomposed. The child was wearing only a white undershirt, a long-sleeved blouse, and socks. Missing were her coat, pants, underwear, and shoes. Nearby, investigators found strands of dark hair and a braided scarf. Due to the condition of the body, there were no visible signs of violence. But the way the body had been left clearly indicated the death was not accidental. Dental analysis confirmed the worst. It was Maria Ridulph. Her family was notified immediately. Michael and Frances received the news with the stunned, wordless grief that only follows a loss of that magnitude. Kathy, Maria's best friend, was informed as well. She would never again speak of that night without breaking down. Due to the advanced decomposition, the autopsy could not determine a definitive cause of death. However, later forensic reports noted multiple incisions around the neck area, consistent with a stabbing. While there was no way to confirm a sexual assault, the absence of underwear and pants strongly suggested a possible sexual motive. No bodily fluids or recoverable DNA were found. Once again, the investigation returned to square one. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no active suspects. In the weeks following the discovery, authorities reopened every interview from the initial investigation. Neighbors were re-questioned. Train reports were re-examined. Even the military and state agencies were contacted in hopes of identifying men named Johnny, but nothing conclusive ever surfaced. Over time, the case faded from public attention and was eventually classified as closed, but not solved. Maria was laid to rest in Elmwood Cemetery in Sycamore. The community placed a plaque bearing her name with a simple inscription, "Never Forgotten." A mural of her face was painted at the local elementary school, and each anniversary, neighbors placed flowers on her grave. Yet justice remained distant. Time passed. The Ridulph family continued living in the town. Maria's mother, Frances, grew old, her grief unchanged. Kathy Sigmund also grew up and eventually married, but she was always remembered as the last person to see Maria alive. She never wavered in her memory of that night. Even though she was only 8 years old at the time, her image of Johnny remained clear. A slim, soft-spoken young man with a gentle smile and a calm manner. Then, in 1994, something shifted. Eileen Tessier, the mother of John Tessier, the young man initially dismissed as a suspect in 1957, was on her deathbed. Her daughters, including Janet Tessier, were by her side. Just before passing away, Eileen said something that deeply unsettled her daughter. "John killed that little girl." Janet never forgot those words. Years went by, but the memory lingered like a persistent echo. In 2008, she decided to act. Janet sent an email to the Sycamore Police Department recounting what her mother had said and asked them to reopen the case and re-examine John Tessier as a potential suspect. Initially, her claims weren't taken seriously, but months later, when a new team of investigators began reviewing cold cases, her message caught their attention, and they began to pull the thread. By then, John Tessier had changed his name to Jack McCullough and was living in Seattle. Outwardly, he had led a respectable life. He had served in the U.S. Air Force, worked as a police officer, married, had children, and retired. But behind this respectable facade, there were inconsistencies. In 1957, Tessier had been under suspicion, but the alibi that cleared him, a train ticket to Chicago, had protected him for over 50 years. Now, investigators began to scrutinize that alibi with modern tools and digitized records. Back then, his mother had claimed that he traveled from Rockford to Chicago on the very day Maria disappeared, supposedly for a military enlistment interview with the Air Force. This trip was said to place him far from Sycamore at 6:45 p.m., the time Maria was last seen. But investigators now carefully examined train schedules, phone records, and witness statements from December 3, 1957. They discovered that the collect call John allegedly made from Rockford to his girlfriend's home, one of the central pieces of his alibi, was placed at 6:57 p.m. That meant, in theory, he could have been in Sycamore at 6:45, abducted Maria within minutes, and immediately driven the 40-minute route to Rockford, just in time to place the call. More troubling was what they found in his military recruitment file. The appointment he claimed to be traveling for was scheduled not for December 3rd, but for December 4th. In other words, there was no valid reason for him to have been in Chicago the night of Maria's disappearance. Investigators also revisited a collection of long-overlooked records. A letter written by his mother expressed that she had always believed John was guilty but had lied to protect him. Old-school reports described his violent and sexualized behavior from a young age. A half-sister testified that he had abused young girls, including herself. Individually, none of these elements was definitive, but together they painted a deeply unsettling picture. Meanwhile, Kathy Sigmund, now known as Kathy Chapman, was interviewed once again as an adult. Investigators presented her with vintage photographs of former suspects, including a 1957 photo of John Tessier. When she saw his image, she did not hesitate. That's Johnny. The case of Jack McCullough and Maria Ridulph. Armed with new information, authorities issued an arrest warrant for Jack McCullough in 2011. He was apprehended at his home in Seattle and extradited to Illinois. At the time of his arrest, he was 71 years old and charged with first-degree kidnapping and murder. It was an extraordinary case, one of the oldest child homicide investigations in the United States ever, to reach trial with a living defendant. During the 2012 trial, prosecutors presented all the evidence at their disposal: the suspicious inconsistencies in McCullough's alibi, the testimony of Kathy Chapman, formerly Sigmund, accounts from McCullough's half-sisters, the deathbed confession of his mother, and his troubling personal history of abusive and disturbing behavior dating back to adolescence. There was, however, no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA. The entire case rested on recollections reconstructed more than half a century later. The defense argued that none of it was conclusive, that memories fade over time, that Kathy's certainty could not be trusted after so many years, that the travel records were ambiguous, and that there was no direct evidence linking McCullough to the crime. Nonetheless, the jury found him guilty. In September 2012, Jack McCullough was sentenced to life in prison. In the courtroom, the Ridulph family wept. After 55 years, someone had finally been held accountable. The case was officially closed, but the story was far from over. Following his conviction, McCullough began serving his life sentence at age 72. However, peace was short-lived. In 2015, DeKalb County's newly elected state's attorney, Richard Schmack, undertook an independent review of the Ridulph case. What he uncovered was deeply troubling. One of the most critical findings was a detailed re-examination of McCullough's alleged phone call from Rockford. That collect call to his girlfriend's house had been placed at 6:57 p.m. from a payphone at the Rockford train station. The same day Maria vanished at around 6:45 p.m. Schmack concluded that it was physically impossible for McCullough to have abducted Maria in Sycamore and reached Rockford, roughly 40 minutes away, in time to make that call. Further scrutiny revealed that McCullough's military enlistment appointment in Chicago had been scheduled for December 4th, not December 3rd, as originally claimed, contradicting the assumption that he had been traveling that night. His train ticket, long dismissed, was now seen as legitimate. In addition, the circumstantial evidence presented at trial, allegations of past abuse and inappropriate behavior, while deeply unsettling, bore no direct connection to Maria's murder. Convinced of McCullough's innocence, Schmack formally petitioned for his conviction to be overturned. In April 2016, a county judge vacated the guilty verdict, and Jack McCullough was released from prison after nearly 4 years behind bars. By September of that year, all charges were dismissed. Finally, in April 2017, McCullough was declared legally innocent, the most definitive legal remedy for a wrongful conviction. The public reaction was deeply divided. Many in Sycamore refused to accept the reversal. Frances Ridulph, Maria's older sister, expressed outrage, calling it a betrayal of her sister's memory. She insisted Kathy had never wavered in her identification of Johnny, and that McCullough's dark past made him the only plausible suspect. For her and much of the local community, the justice system had released Maria's killer, yet to others, the case stood as a painful cautionary tale. An example of what can go wrong when investigations rely on faded memories, public pressure, and the absence of forensic evidence. There was never a single piece of physical proof tying McCullough to the crime. Today, Maria Ridulph's murder remains officially unsolved. Her name still adorns the commemorative plaque in Sycamore, and the town's older residents still recall that freezing December night that changed their sense of safety forever. After his exoneration, Jack McCullough attempted to sue the state for wrongful imprisonment, but his life had already been indelibly marked. He spent his final years under the shadow of a crime he claimed he did not commit, haunted by a stigma he could never fully escape. The case of Maria Ridulph is a sobering reminder of how easily justice can falter, how fragile memory can be, and how devastating the consequences of error may become. The case of Diane Maxwell. She parked her car and began walking toward the security booth where she usually left her coat, but she never made it to clock in. It took only a single morning, a fleeting moment, to erase her presence. For 34 years, no one knew who had taken her life, until a long-forgotten fingerprint tucked away in a drawer finally spoke. This is the story of Diane Maxwell, Houston, Texas. It was Sunday, December 14, 1969. The city was just beginning to stir when 25-year-old Diane Maxwell left her young son in her mother's care, picked up her purse and keys, and headed to work. She was a switchboard operator at Southwestern Bell Telephone Company, a reliable employee, a young mother determined to give her child a stable life. She never shirked her responsibilities. At 6:15 a.m., she pulled into the employee parking lot of a downtown Houston building, driving her red Mustang. From there, she was to walk a short distance to a small locker room where operators would store their belongings and clock in. But Diane never reached the time card station. Within minutes of parking, a man approached her car, dragged her out, and forced her into an abandoned shed behind an old gas station. Just 2 blocks away, the attack was swift and brutal. Diane was beaten, sexually assaulted, strangled, and stabbed. She died from internal bleeding caused by one of the wounds. She was just 25. Her body was discovered that same afternoon, lying on the floor of the shed, partially covered with a filthy blanket, Her undergarments had been removed, her blouse torn. Near the body were fragments of her purse and her identification. The scene left no doubt. It was a spontaneous sexual assault marked by savage violence. Houston homicide detectives arrived within minutes. The red Mustang was still in the parking lot, untouched. Inside the car, partial fingerprints were visible. One on the gear shift, another on the rearview mirror. Investigators also lifted a partial palm print from the side of the shed. The evidence was cataloged and photographed. But in 1969, there was no national fingerprint database. Matches had to be made manually, one by one. There were no hits. No one had seen Diane walking that morning. No one noticed the man who intercepted her. The case remained open but directionless. As time passed, it was reassigned to various divisions, with no breakthroughs. Diane's family, particularly her brother David Maxwell, who would later become a Texas Ranger, persistently advocated for the case to be revisited. Each anniversary, each forensic advancement sparked renewed hope. But the evidence remained silent. The prints were unidentified, the memory of the case faded. Diane was buried in quiet grief. Her son grew up motherless. The detectives retired. Houston changed. The surrounding sheds were torn down. The site of the crime became part of a modern parking complex. Still, Diane's case file remained open, dormant among the city's cold cases, until 2003. That year, the Houston Police Department modernized its cold case unit. With access to advanced forensic technology, detectives began reevaluating fingerprint evidence from decades-old unsolved crimes. One of the most powerful tools was AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, which could process and compare prints across national databases in seconds. The evidence from Diane Maxwell's case was reviewed using this new system. Among the carefully preserved impressions taken in 1969, one partial palm print yielded an immediate match. James Ray Davis. In 1969, Davis was 25, the same age as Diane. A low-level criminal with prior theft charges, he had been released from prison just 9 days before her murder. At the time, he wasn't questioned. He wasn't even on the investigators' radar. The match placed him squarely at the scene. Detectives quickly located Davis in Atlanta, Texas, about 5 hours from Houston. He was now 58. When the officers arrived at his door, they presented the evidence, fingerprints, photos, documentation tying him to Diane's car, and the shed where her body was found. James Ray Davis didn't deny it. He confessed. He said he didn't know Diane. He simply saw an opportunity. He intercepted her as she stepped out of her car, attacked on impulse, and stole her purse. He admitted to dragging her to the shed, beating her, and killing her. He denied the sexual assault, but the condition of the crime scene told another story. He was arrested immediately. A case that had been frozen for 34 years was resolved within days, thanks to a single print that had waited untouched in an evidence drawer. In November 2003, James Ray Davis pleaded guilty to the murder of Diane Maxwell. There was no lengthy trial. No jury needed convincing. He pleaded guilty before the judge and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the hearing, Diane's brother David was present. He did not speak to the media. He simply stated that after so many years it was not complete closure, but it was closure nonetheless. Davis was sent to a Texas state prison, where he spent the remainder of his life behind bars. He died in 2007, just 4 years after his conviction. Although he was never linked to other crimes, his record suggests that the attack on Diane may not have been his first act of violence. The murder of Diane Maxwell was solved, but never forgotten. Her case remains one of the oldest in Houston to be resolved through forensic technology. Today, her name appears in police training materials as a key example of the importance of preserving evidence and of the remarkable power a single fingerprint can wield when time and science finally align. For her family, though decades had passed, the truth finally arrived. On a December morning, Diane Maxwell left for work as she always did. She never returned, but her story did not end that day. It ended on the day someone was finally held accountable. The case of Jacob Wetterling. It was an ordinary day in a small Minnesota town when Jacob went out for a bike ride and vanished without a trace. For nearly 3 decades, his family and community endured an unrelenting nightmare, until one confession changed everything. This is the story of Jacob Wetterling. On October 22, 1989, St. Joseph, Minnesota woke to a crisp breeze and clear skies. For 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, the day began like any other. He lived with his parents, Patty and Jerry Wetterling, and his siblings in a modest home near the town's elementary school. The family was close-knit and loving. Jacob was an active, cheerful boy who loved riding his bike, playing with friends, and spending time with his family. That morning, Patty rose early to prepare breakfast and get the children ready for school and other activities. Jacob was especially excited. He had plans that Sunday to visit the local video rental store with his younger brother, Trevor, and a friend, Aaron Larson. Afterward, they intended to ride their bikes around the neighborhood. The video store was a popular spot for local kids. Their outing was simple: have fun, spend time together, and be home before dark. Jacob hopped on his red bicycle and waved goodbye. Patty reminded him to return before sundown and to stay safe. He smiled and promised he would. That afternoon, the three boys arrived at the video store, selected a few tapes, and began their ride home. It was a peaceful and familiar routine. But near 8:00 p.m. at the intersection that led to their homes, they encountered a van. Inside were three men who watched them closely. In seconds, the van stopped. Armed men stepped out without warning, ordering the boys to get off their bikes and lie face down on the ground. The boys froze in fear. One of the men approached Jacob, separated him from the others, and threatened him with a firearm. He forced Jacob into the van while the other two boys, Trevor and Aaron, remained on the ground, too terrified to move. They were warned not to look or speak. Minutes later, they were let go. Jacob was taken and never seen again. The next day, Jacob's parents realized he hadn't returned. His disappearance was reported immediately. What followed was a massive, desperate search. Rescue teams, police officers and volunteers, entire families from St. Joseph and nearby towns organized to find him. Forests, rivers, rural roads, and abandoned properties were combed. For weeks, search dogs and helicopters covered as much ground as possible. Dozens were interviewed, but no solid leads emerged. In the days that followed, fear and anguish gripped the town. National media took an interest. The Wetterlings appeared on several television programs to plead for help and keep Jacob's case alive. His disappearance became a national symbol of children's vulnerability and the urgent need for stronger protection and oversight. But the investigation faced a major obstacle: the total absence of solid evidence and the lack of reliable witnesses. Despite unprecedented mobilization, the crucial first hours turned into days, then weeks, then months without progress. The St. Joseph Police, with support from the FBI, deployed extensive resources for a missing child case in a small town. They interviewed hundreds: neighbors, merchants, teachers, friends, and family, yet none could provide useful information about the men in the van or Jacob's whereabouts. The police compiled vague descriptions of the perpetrators, white males aged 20 to 40, who acted with chilling calm and violence. But there were no names, no recognizable faces. Vehicle records yielded nothing. Meanwhile, the Wetterling family lived through a private hell. Patty and Jerry transformed into tireless advocates, speaking publicly, appearing on television, and raising awareness about child safety. In Jacob's name, the Jacob Wetterling Act was passed in 1994, establishing the first national sex offender registry. The law significantly improved surveillance protocols, requiring registered sex offenders to report their residential addresses and mandating close monitoring by authorities to prevent future cases like Jacob's. However, the family's pain remained unrelenting. Each anniversary served as a cruel reminder of both Jacob's absence and the ongoing uncertainty. For more than 2 decades, the case remained frozen. Investigations were periodically updated with the advent of new technologies or the emergence of new leads, but none yielded success. Among the initial suspects, one figure stood out: Danny Heinrich, a man with a criminal record and a known history of violent and abusive behavior. He lived near St. Joseph and had previously been under police scrutiny for unrelated offenses. In 2015, advancements in DNA analysis and national forensic databases allowed investigators to connect biological evidence collected at the scene to Heinrich. He was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. During the initial interrogations, Heinrich denied any involvement. However, under the weight of the mounting evidence, he eventually agreed to cooperate. Guided by Heinrich, police discovered Jacob's remains buried in a rural field near Painesville, approximately 40 kilometers from the site of his abduction. After nearly 30 years of anguish, the Wetterling family was finally able to bury their son and begin healing from the wounds left by decades of uncertainty. The case was formally closed, and Heinrich was sentenced to life imprisonment. Jacob Wetterling's story transcended the personal and the judicial. It became a national symbol of child protection, a somber warning about children's vulnerability, and a rallying cry for systemic change. Heinrich's arrest in September 2015 marked a turning point in a case that had remained unsolved for 26 years. At the time, Heinrich was a 50-year-old man with only minor prior offenses, nothing that had previously marked him as a serious threat. However, DNA evidence now indisputably links him to Jacob's abduction and murder. Investigators had previously recovered DNA samples from the crime scene, but it was only with the development of advanced national forensic databases that a match was finally made. After his arrest, Heinrich initially remained tight-lipped, denying any involvement. Yet as the evidence mounted, he ultimately agreed to a plea deal. He confessed to the kidnapping and murder of Jacob Wetterling. Although he never fully disclosed all details about the burial site, he did lead authorities to the location of the body, a field on the outskirts of Painesville. The discovery of Jacob's remains was both heartbreaking and cathartic. While it devastated the family and community, it also provided the closure they had been denied for nearly 3 decades. A formal funeral was held, attended by family, friends, and community members who had clung to hope for so many years. Legally, Heinrich was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. Given the overwhelming evidence and his confession, a lengthy trial was unnecessary. He pled guilty and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. During the proceedings, statements from family members and expert witnesses highlighted the case's profound impact on U.S. legislation. The Jacob Wetterling Act, passed in 1994, was among the first to mandate a national registry of sex offenders, aiming to prevent similar crimes. It also laid the groundwork for further federal laws that enhance the public's access to sex offender information and strengthen child protection measures. Following his sentencing, Heinrich remained incarcerated in a Minnesota state prison. No further crimes were ever directly linked to him, though some experts speculate he may have committed lesser offenses that were either unreported or undetected. The community of St. Joseph and all of Minnesota entered a long, difficult process of healing. Jacob's disappearance remained a painful memory, but also a legacy that drove awareness, reform, and a national commitment to safeguarding children. Jacob Wetterling's story became a powerful symbol of change and social awareness. His mother, Patty Wetterling, continued her advocacy by supporting other families affected by abductions and violent crimes, while also championing child safety education. Jacob's case is not only a heartbreaking account of loss and grief, but also a profound testament to the enduring power of perseverance, the advances of forensic science, and the unwavering dedication of communities in the pursuit of justice and the protection of society's most vulnerable.